whatever that means. Hey, so yeah, really delightful to have a chance to be with you and think through this again. So we were just chatting about well, so over the last few weeks, we've been talking a bit about, I'd introduced this concept of the 8 worldly concerns and how naturally, even though on one level, we're mostly concerned about pleasure and pain, like everything gets boiled down to pleasure and pain. Pleasure and pain in all of our senses, certainly including that just bodily felt sense of like, do you feel good or do you feel bad? And that then the 8 worldly concerns are also concerns for resources and respect and praise and blame and good reputation, bad reputations. That has a lot to do with where we fit into a social structure. So if we think about that in a really the powerful thing, the thing that's really continues to more and more and more deeply impress me is the way in which, at least the Buddhist tradition that I was taught in, focuses on understanding the mind experientially and by breaking it down into its component pieces. And so at some point along this way, I've guided a meditation where we pay attention to all of the various objects of our senses. 5 senses. Sometimes we talk about a 6th sense. 6th sense doesn't mean psychic powers in this context. It means like your thoughts. And so what can we see? What can we see around us? What can we hear? What can we smell? What can we taste? What's the feeling, the felt awareness? And what's the mental awareness that's going on around us? Going on around us, going on inside us. What's the mental awareness? And so these senses, they're traditionally they're referred to as doors, the sense doors. And it's interesting, a doorway in your house or a window, is it inside or is it outside? Well, I don't know. It's just a space that kind of is a bridge between the inside and the outside, whatever that is, right? And our house is really just a bubble, just a container. The space is the same, whether the space is inside the house or outside the house. And the doorway is basically just showing that, it's all just one space, inside, outside. And so a house, for example, as a building is kind of, and on one level, it's an arbitrary container. You can set up a tent. You can set up in anywhere. You can just set up, and it's a little bubble. And that little bubble sort of defines this is inside and this is outside. And everything is like that, right? Even the body is like a little bubble. We say, oh, that's the outside and this is the inside. But of course, we're carrying with us all of the opinions, biases, beliefs, feelings, things we've learned in the past, influences by society, parents, and then we project around us. If you look visually around whatever space you're in, there's a lot of things that have a sentimental meaning for you. In fact, probably everything has a sentimental meaning, just in the sense that it has a different meaning for you than it would for somebody else, right? Every book, I've got a bookshelf over here. Every book on the bookshelf has a different meaning for me than it does for other people. Often there's an overlap or a similarity. And so we sometimes try to talk about a difference between subjective and objective, right? Like a binary. Like there's some things that are subjective and some things that are objective. And objectively, there's a book, but subjectively, I like it or I don't like it. But even those things are just concepts. They're just distinctions. You can't experience anything. There's nothing you can experience with your senses that is purely objective. Because the only way you can experience is through your subjective senses. So everything we're seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, thinking, it's all sort of a negotiation or an interplay between inner and outer. we tend to, especially we tend to, there's a process. I like this term. It's um, called sense making, and some big thinkers that I've only bumped into in recent years have talk a lot about sense making. That's what we do as living beings. We are sense makers. We're trying to make sense of what's going on, right? You try to like make sense of your environment. I look around and I'm like, oof, I need to clean my room. That's the most clear sense that I can make of this environment right now. Or you look at the news and you're like, how do I make sense of this? Oh, well, I guess it's, this and that, it's Republicans versus Democrats, it's US versus China, it's conflict, it's Omicron, and it's viruses, and it's all these. We try to make sense of our world. Is the world safe, or is the world dangerous? For example, and it's funny. Eileen was mentioning about pandemic-inspired music, right? And briefly, mentioning two variations, right? Like music characterized by anxiety and music characterized by tranquility. And you just think about, this it looks like a binary, but you sort of see how things can kind of come between these states very easily. And I hope this maybe feels like a little bit of an obscure analogy, but when you turn the faucet on in your house, it can either be like what appears to be like a white stream of water, or it can appear to be what's like a clear, transparent stream of water. So if the water is flowing very hard, it's going to be like white because it's bubbles and foam, and on a small level, it's what you call turbulent flow of water. And the same like in a river. If the river's flowing gently, it's what's called laminar flow. There's technical terms, but it just means it's that all the water molecules are fairly cohesive. They're not disturbed. There's not a whole lot of water bubbles in there or turbulence on the surface. Water has a tendency to just stick together. But if it's disturbed, it goes into what's called turbulent flow. So the stream, hits the rapids and starts bouncing water, or from your faucet, the same thing happens. But it's the same stuff, water, right? Whether it's laminar flow. Again, it's a weird set of terms to be introducing in a meditation class. I don't know. I studied fluid. I took 3 miserable semesters of fluid mechanics in university. It was basically, that was the straw that broke the camel's back and made me drop out of that particular engineering discipline. I'm like, but anyway, I came away with knowing what the difference between laminar and turbulent flow. But water's the same stuff, right? But if it can be turbulent, but it can be smooth, laminar flow, right? And the same thing with this pandemic-inspired music, right? What's the experience? Sometimes in the midst of turbulence and chaos and so forth, you can find some moment of tranquility and clarity, right? And it's like the mind becomes still, and we're not always able to hold it as long as we want, but the possibility is there. And if that's not such a familiar experience, if it feels like most of our life or much of our life is characterized by this turbulence, at least we can have hope that it and assurances from people who have had that experience that you can find this peace and tranquility even in the midst of anxiety-provoking situations, and that we as humans need that, because as soon as the mind moves, this mind, the 6th sense, right? When the mind moves from this turbulent, worried, disturbed state into a clear, laminar, lucid, tranquil state, we experience peace. And for our body, for our body, we know the feeling of pleasure and pain. Stroke your hand with a feather, poke it with a needle, you know the difference. But with our mind, pleasure and pain is really an experience of peace or disturbance, peace or agitation. It's the mental equivalent. And peace doesn't mean that you're still. Like, you can be riding your bike, you can be like in the midst of a dramatic, dynamic conversation and so forth, but that on one level, you feel like you are where you're supposed to be. You feel like things are right. There's a sense of things being right, and there is a peace in that. And so pleasure and pain, pleasure and pain, pleasant and unpleasant, they're all just terms for this spectrum of feeling. And we when we look at something visually and we find it attractive, that's visual pleasant object. If you find something unattractive, it's a visual unpleasant object. If you hear something's beautiful sound, it's an auditory pleasant object. Unpleasant sound, it's a auditory unpleasant object. From sound, smells, pleasant and unpleasant. Tastes, pleasant and unpleasant. But what we're consciously or unconsciously, what we're really motivated by are these bodily and mental good feelings. And that's what we're really trying to find our way into. And we use our senses as like probes and feelers to sort of say, I think that if I go here and hang out with these beautiful people and listen to this beautiful music and so forth, then I'll have a good feeling. But if you're in a beautiful place and there's beautiful music and wonderful smells and food and so forth, but for whatever reason you're angry, you ruin your night. Your night was ruined, right? Like, that's the final determinant of did you have a good night or not, is did you end the evening or the day or the whatever with a good feeling. And a good mental feeling and a good physical feeling, they're pretty closely related because our mind and body play off each other a lot. And even when we, our social connection, if you think back to these 8 worldly concerns of pleasure and pain, and then there's beginning to, respect and praise and reputation. What we're really looking for in a social situation is, do we feel good there? Right? And so the question came up, I think on Tuesday from John about what about people who prefer to be on their own? Like, what about people who don't, I was making the claim of we're incredibly motivated by social status and so forth. John's like, what about people who like to be on their own? Excellent point. And I think at the end of the day, it comes down to what makes us feel good. Do you feel better to be on your own? Do you feel better to be in a group? I think on one level, if people could be in a group, I think on one level, there is a part of our mind that kind of wishes we could find a group that made us feel good. Small group, large group, huge group, like if, and I think that one of the reasons we have so much admiration for these famous musicians and performers and so forth is because, in a sense, they're right in the center of this massive, massive group of people. And these people are having a wonderful experience, the performers having a wonderful experience. And there's part of our mind, I think, that kind of wants to be a rock star. Like when we were little, I mean, how many of you, when you were little, pretended to be rock stars? And perhaps really took a go at it, right? But people like that. But the question is, if you've had enough bad experiences of trying to find your way in social groups and so forth, that eventually you just conclude, like, I just don't like hanging out with people. I just do not like parties. I just do not like whatever. Then you'll tend to keep to yourself. But really, at the end of the day, it's all about can we successfully navigate ourselves to a pleasant feeling? And on a mental level, that really means, can we navigate ourselves to a state of peace, even including peace in motion, like this laminar flow in water, like this stream just kind of flowing, peace in motion. So we've talked about last in the Tuesday class, we talked about this the practice of giving and receiving respect, and the importance of cultivating respect, and one extreme of respect being worship, where people get together and they basically practice. People may not have told you that this is what worship is about, or like religious behavior. People may never have told you that that's what it's about, because people don't consciously know that that's what it's about. But it's a group of people getting together and practicing having deep respect for something. And if you focus on anything, your mind will really get into it, right? Your mind will really, that tendency for the mind to really get into something, whatever it is, a puzzle, a book, a conversation, whatever, and you forget about everything else at that time. We like that experience, right? But you can get into something, you can get obsessed with things that are unpleasant, right? Like you can be obsessed with like, oh God, that thing that they said to me, and I'm still thinking about it years later, right? So our ability to focus and obsess, we can focus and obsess on unpleasant things. We can focus and obsess on pleasant things. Like, oh, I've got to have that thing. Oh, I wish But there's a middle way. There's a really interesting middle way, which is focusing the mind on focusing the mind on something and intentionally opposing the perception of faults, like intentionally pushing faults out of our mind and intentionally trying to develop a positive feeling about that thing. And what's a good example? There's a strange example, but no little child likes the smell of alcohol. That's my thesis. No little child likes the smell of alcohol. It's naturally a little unpleasant. It's poison. It's just natural repulsion. But over time, through social pressure, the familiarity, whatever, people come to enjoy the taste of alcohol. And people can come to get into things like wine tastings, and they can come to like really focus on these very subtle distinctions in flavor and bouquet and so forth. And that's a kind of focusing and zooming in on something that is actually kind of unpleasant. It's I'm a little biased. I don't do much of that, but then you think about whiskey tastings. Like that stuff is, I find whiskey, the smell and taste and appearance and so forth, to be relatively indistinguishable from gasoline. But some people, they learn how to develop this real taste. They just get over that sharp, unpleasant taste feeling of alcohol, and they're just like, I'm just going to ignore all of that unpleasantness and just focus on these the smoothness of that taste. It just goes down so much smoother than regular unleaded. That is an example of how our mind kind of pushes out the perception of faults. Also, marketing does that. Marketing does that, like, okay, I know all these things don't work very well. Don't look at those. Look at these, right? And it's intentionally cultivating, like, look at this. This is amazing, right? So we know that other people can do that to us, right? Other people can manipulate the appearance of things to us. And, we know we can do it like in a social, like if we're trying to show off and like impress people, we know in a social context, we can come to ignore unpleasant things and focus on, the pleasant things. But what we also need to know that we can do is we can do it intentionally ourselves. We can come to perceive something as pleasant that we previously naturally perceived as unpleasant. And one of the most powerful and challenging things to come to perceive as pleasant is pain. So if you can transform pain and find tranquility and peace and so forth in the midst of pain and difficulties, you have really done something very special with your mind. And there's a famous line from a Buddhist text called Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. It says, moreover, suffering has many good qualities. Moreover, suffering has many good qualities. Through experiencing it, we can dispel pride. Through experiencing it, we can dispel pride, develop compassion for those who are trapped in their circumstances, abandon non-virtue and negative tendencies, negative actions, and delight in virtue. And to abandon non-virtue and delight in virtue especially is easier if you have some belief in karma, that any difficulties we're facing or suffering we face is something that, theoretically we have the power to overcome through changing the way our mind works. So transforming difficult conditions into something that is helping us and benefiting us in some way, on some level, beginning to develop a taste for difficulties as a teacher or an aid on the path, or helping us to develop humility or compassion, probably two of the biggest, best ones, but that's extraordinarily powerful. So there is a practice. There's a simple way. There's a ton in the Buddhist tradition. There's a ton of different ways of approaching that, of doing that. And it's one of the most powerful and popular subsets of teachings is what's called transforming adverse conditions. And one of the simplest approaches is just thinking, whenever we experience suffering or difficulty or pain, we think this situation is teaching me that the suffering of others is far greater than my own suffering. And that there are so many levels of profundity on that statement. This situation is teaching me that the sufferings of others are far greater than my own sufferings. But what in effect it's saying is that our own pain can become a teacher. And for context, we need to appreciate that if something teaches us, if something is a teacher that teaches us humility, then effectively it is a spiritual teacher. If something's a teacher that teaches us compassion, then effectively it's a spiritual teacher. If something's a teacher that teaches us, how we need to be careful with our actions, then it is a teacher, a spiritual teacher. And we need to develop a mind of utmost respect. I told you how worship is structured in the Buddhist tradition, that the focus is Buddha as the supreme teacher. There's different ways of worshiping in different traditions, but developing respect for a teacher, Buddha, and then their teachings, Dharma, and then the Sangha means the community of people who have gained some insight into the teachings. It's all about education. The whole Buddhist faith path, if you want, it's about increasing our ability to learn. And there's two ways of learning. There's learning from somebody talking, blah, 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 right? And then there's learning from direct experience. And learning from direct experience is so much more powerful, but you typically need a bit of advice to figure out what you should learn from that direct experience. So typically suffering is in plentiful supply. It's not a scarce commodity. the ability to transform that suffering into something that's useful for us is much more rare. But what you're doing at that time is your mind is actually performing a miracle. That is technically what you call a miracle. I think it's a miracle if somebody can sip whiskey and find that pleasant. So I know miracles are possible, right? There's miracles happen all the time, right? People can listen to an accordion and think, oh, this is pleasant music. That's a miracle. Just teasing. Accordions have terrible, bad reputation. They're wonderful, wonderful instruments. But miracles are plentiful. People are doing miracles all the time, right? But the miracles we actually need to pull off are the miracle of taking our whatever, if you've got a disaster of a life, say, right, to take your whatever state your life is in, it's maybe your life's not a disaster, but it's probably a little bit scuffed up. It's used, right? If you buy something new, it's always shiny. I try not to buy new things if I have an alternative, because as soon as I buy something new, it becomes used. As soon as I touch it, it becomes used. And so I know that there's no real new things. I try to buy used things, but our life is like already a bit scuffed up and battered and, tattered around the edges. And our life is a used thing, right? But if we can take this life that's a bit rough and we can miraculously transform this by developing a different way of viewing it, we have performed a miracle that is extraordinarily relevant to us, right? That nobody else can perform that miracle. And that's a meditation that is a personal meditation. It's a meditation that is something that only we can do. It's sort of unique and needs to be customized to us. So that's an extremely long preliminary, and apologies for that. But that's what I thought we could meditate on now, having set the stage. So meditating on the difficulties that we face in our life, and then thinking, is there some benefit? What benefit can I extract from that? Humility, and so forth. So why don't we settle in for some meditation now? And just recalling, finding a comfortable position, sitting on our back straight but relaxed, finding, however we can, this balance between alertness and relaxation. And we take a deep breath in. And out. And then we take another deep breath in and out and allow ourselves to relax. And then another breath. We just ask ourselves what is important right now. So we just think about how we engage with the world through these doorways of our senses. And we can recognize that something can look unpleasant, but we still can like it if it has some sentimental meaning for us. We can have a good feeling even towards things that look unpleasant. And even something that sounds unpleasant. To some people's ears, we may enjoy that sound. People have different tastes in music, for example. The point is, what is the feeling that is generating in our hearts? Similarly, even a smell that for a child, like alcohol, that for a child is deeply unpleasant, people can come to enjoy or appreciate that smell. And the same with tastes, things that we found unpleasant tastes as children, we can appreciate if we know that they're good for us, medicine or healthy food. But just because something initially appears unpleasant doesn't mean that we have to feel unpleasantly about it. When we think about physical pain, so if someone pokes us with a pin, we find that unpleasant. But if they're giving us an injection of life-saving medicine, we find ourselves very grateful. We can have a pleasant, grateful feeling. People don't naturally enjoy exertion, strain, lifting heavy weights, but people can develop a taste for that feeling, learn how to enjoy the feeling of exercise, even the feeling of being hungry. If you learn to diet, you can develop an appreciation even for physical pain if there's a good meaning behind it. But our sixth sense just means our mental awareness. This sixth sense, there are things that have hurt us. There are things that have hurt our feelings. Feeling of being excluded from a group, not respected, a feeling of failure or not accomplishing something, feelings of anxiety, pain, loss. These are our sufferings. And often they're very private. They're very private sufferings. We can all look at a painting and see more or less the same thing, but no one can see the private sufferings that we each go through. Even our partners may not know about some of the things that cause us suffering. But just like every other object of the senses can be transformed, if we want, we could call it a miracle to transform something unpleasant into something pleasant. Those miracles happen all the time, right? So the miracle we need to perform, totally within our power, is the miracle of taking our sufferings, the unpleasant parts of our life, and transforming them into something beneficial. We can start with humility and we can think, do these sufferings show me that I'm not perfect, not better than others, not special. Do these sufferings dispel my pride? A mind of pride is like the top of a rocky mountain peak where water never accumulates. But a humble mind is like a mountain valley where water naturally flows in. So if we are proud, we will never listen. We will never learn. We won't connect with others. We will feel isolated. If we're humble, we can empathize with anyone, even a prisoner, someone who is a refugee, who's lost their country and home. We've lost things, but have we lost our home, our country? Have we may have lost loved ones, but have we lost everyone we knew or loved? Just like our eyes are a doorway to perceiving outer objects, our suffering is a doorway to humility. The space inside a house and the space outside a house are exactly the same. The doorway allows you to travel between inside and outside. So in the same way, every single living being is basically the same. Our suffering, every living being is basically the same. We all face vulnerability, loss, disappointment, pain. Our suffering is a doorway to connect our own experience to the experience of every other living being. We are not alone. We never were alone. We have always been connected to every other living being. And our suffering is a doorway. And if we just step through with humility, we connect profoundly at the heart with every other single living being in the universe. So as we begin to bring our meditation to a close, we can recall that every thought we think, every action we take is deepening mental pathway. And the mental pathway of transforming suffering into humility, compassion, and love for others may not be such a deeply familiar pathway today, but eventually it can become a superhighway that we ourselves and every other person is deeply familiar with. We can change society if we can change ourselves. How many people experience suffering in their lives? How many people would love a way to transform that miraculously into a strength? And we just hold for the last minute this vision of how wonderful it would be if everyone could transform their suffering and difficulties in this way. And make a decision to practice, to keep practicing like this in our daily life, to look for how we can transform our own suffering and difficulties into teachings, to good qualities. And we can open our eyes from our meditation.